My name is Nora Calloway and I was 41 years old, standing in my mother's dining room on a Thursday afternoon in March when the attorney set 5 cream envelopes on the table and said, "Your mother asked me to give you these today." 5 envelopes, 5 names, same handwriting, same stationery, same careful weight in the hand when I picked mine up. Richard held his flat with both palms, like he was keeping it from moving. Catherine held hers by the corner, already suspicious of it. David turned his over twice before he opened it, because of course he did. Elaine pressed hers to her chest and started crying before she had read a single word. I held mine in my lap and looked at my name in my mother's handwriting and knew, with the awful certainty that only a child can have about a parent, that this was the last time she would surprise me. My mother was Joan Calloway. She had been a middle school English teacher for 31 years and the sort of woman who could mark a grammar mistake on a grocery receipt and still somehow make you feel grateful for the correction. She died 9 days before that afternoon, at 74, from pancreatic cancer that had been diagnosed 11 months earlier and had moved through her body with the grim efficiency of something that had never intended to negotiate. The attorney was Martin Hayes. He was in his 60s and had the face of a man who had delivered difficult paperwork before, but not often with this level of emotional collateral. He said, "Your mother came to my office 13 months ago and asked me to hold these letters until after her death." He paused, then added, "She returned 4 times to revise them." He folded his hands over his legal pad and looked around the room the way people do when they are trying to make sure they are not responsible for what happens next. "She wanted me to tell you," he said, "that the letters are identical." He said the word identical carefully, as if it had been underlined for him. Richard nodded once. Catherine narrowed her eyes. David stared at his envelope as though it had developed a pulse. Elaine wiped her nose with the back of her hand and said, under her breath, "That does not sound like her." It didn't. I looked at Martin Hayes and understood something he did not understand about my mother. She had not told him the letters were identical. She had told him to tell us they were identical. That was her way. My mother had spent 31 years teaching 13-year-olds how to write the same essay in 100 different ways and how to hide themselves in plain sight while they were doing it. She understood, better than anyone I have ever known, that people reveal the most when they think they are sounding like everyone else. She had applied that understanding to her children for all of our lives. We were 5, and our family had never behaved like a family of 5 should in theory behave, because theory assumes the children arrive evenly spaced and the parents are evenly patient, and life never works that cleanly. Richard was born first, when my mother was 24 and my father was 26, and they still had the kind of marriage that made them believe every difficulty could be solved by talking longer. Richard had the first child's burden of being the prototype. He was born into a house with young parents and 1,000 unset expectations, and he absorbed all of them. He became the child who learned early that competence made adults relax. He was the one who remembered where things were, who knew what had been promised to whom, who could step in before a problem became visible and make the room feel organized again. He became a corporate attorney and spent his life building his entire personality out of useful posture. Catherine came 3 years later and immediately acted as though the family had made room for her by accident. She was the second child, and if Richard was the one who learned to comply, Catherine was the one who learned to argue with the shape of the room itself. She became a journalist. She was sharp in the way some people are sharp because softness was never offered as a safe option. Then I came, the third child, the middle one, the one my mother once described on the phone to a friend when she did not know I was standing in the hallway listening. "Nora sees everything," she had said, "and says almost nothing." I don't know whether to be proud of that or worried. I was 16 at the time and I remember thinking that she had accidentally diagnosed me. I became a family therapist, which should surprise no one. David was 4th. He was the one who arrived after the family had already learned to be a family and therefore got the privilege of becoming himself in the spare space the rest of us had left behind. He was musical in a way that made dinner tables feel like concerts if he was in the mood to talk. He went to Nashville at 22 and never fully came back, not because he didn't love us but because he had figured out early that loyalty and proximity are not always the same thing. Elaine was last, born when my mother was 38 and my father was 40, and the rest of us had already become a system. She was the one who arrived into a house full of people who were beginning to think they understood one another and quietly proved they did not. She was the kindest of us, which is not the same thing as the weakest. People make that mistake because kindness is often quieter than power and they think the quieter thing must be smaller. Elaine became a kindergarten teacher, which felt like a continuation of my mother's life in a different key. Our father had died 6 years earlier. Heart attack, driveway, Saturday morning, October. There are deaths that arrive with a long warning and death that reorganize the world in the space of a minute, and his was the second kind. We had spent the first year after his death learning how to exist without the person who had held the family's center of gravity whether we realized it or not. Richard had tried to become him. Catherine had fought that. David had stayed away longer than usual. Elaine had moved closer to my mother. And I had done what I always did, which was watch every piece of it and say almost nothing because saying things in a family like ours ours was too often mistaken for choosing sides. My mother watched too. She watched all of us. Teaching middle school for 3 decades had made her fluent in subtext, in the distinction between what people say and what they mean to be heard saying. She never wasted a glance. She never forgot a pattern. She kept notes on the backs of church bulletins and receipts and old notebooks with enough discipline that when she was gone I found half a dozen pieces of paper with our names on them in the glove box of her car. The envelopes in front of us were not a shock in the abstract. My mother believed in leaving instructions, but the fact that there were 5 and that Martin Hayes had said identical with such emphasis meant this was not just paperwork. This was something else. Martin closed his folder. Your mother asked that you read them privately, he said. Not together. Richard looked up. So we can't compare? You can do whatever you want, Martin said, which is lawyer language for I am leaving now before this becomes my problem. But she believed you would be tempted. Elaine let out a wet laugh through her tears. She knew us. Yes, I said, still holding the envelope in my lap. She did. Martin stood. He gave us each a small nod, left the room, and closed the front door behind him. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then Richard opened his envelope. That sound, paper sliding free, the tiny crack of the seal giving way, was the sound of a family about to find out whether love had been organized or merely hoped for. Richard read for less than a minute before his expression changed. Not dramatically. He was too practiced for that. But I saw it anyway, the small fracture near his mouth, the moment his face stopped being a shield and became a face again. Catherine looked at him. What? He didn't answer. He reread the first paragraph, then folded the page once and smoothed it out with his thumb like the paper itself had offended him. What does it say? Catherine asked again. Richard looked up, and the thing he said first was, she knew. Then he stopped. He read the rest of the page with one hand pressed over his eyes. I remember thinking, even before I saw the rest, that my mother had done what she always did best. She had not simply written a letter. She had written a mirror and given it to people who were used to seeing only the version of themselves they preferred. Because the first line in Richard's letter was not sentimental. It was not about being first, or loved, or special. It was this: you learned responsibility before you learned tenderness. And then, underneath it, that was never the same thing as being strong. I am not sure I have ever seen Richard be shocked in his adult life, but he was shocked then. Not by cruelty, by accuracy. My mother wrote to him about how he had spent his entire life becoming useful before he had become known. She wrote that first children often mistake being needed for being valued, because when they are young adults praise them most when they are helping. She told him that he had turned that lesson into a personality. She told him he had spent years performing calm so convincingly that even he had started to believe it was peace. And then she wrote the line that made him lower the page. You are not the house. You live in it. Catherine made a sharp inhale through her teeth, the sound she made when she was trying not to say something mean that was also true. Richard didn't speak. He just kept reading. He read the whole thing, then set it carefully on the table beside his untouched glass of water. He looked older than he had 10 minutes earlier. Catherine said, I'm next. She opened her envelope with the confidence of a woman who believed she could survive anything if she knew the angle it was coming from. My mother's letter to Catherine began like this. You have always thought truth and closeness were the same thing. They are not. Catherine looked up at the ceiling and laughed once, very quietly, as if to say of course she would start here. My mother wrote that Catherine had spent most of her life becoming the one person in the family willing to say the hard thing out loud, and that this had made her invaluable and, at times, unbearable. She wrote that she admired Catherine's courage but worried about her weaponizing it. Truth without gentleness is only a sharper way to hurt people, the letter said. Catherine went still. I watched her reread that sentence 3 times. Then she said, that's not fair. But her voice broke on the word fair, which told me she knew it was. David opened his letter next, and I knew from the way he lowered his head that his would be the one to hit him hardest. David had spent his whole adult life trying to make leaving look like a style choice instead of what it also was, which was a kind of wound. He had always been the family member everyone described as easygoing, which was not accurate. He was just the only one who had learned how to carry his burdens like they weren't burdening anyone else. He got to the second page and then stopped. Then he laughed, not because anything was funny, but because he had been caught by a sentence he didn't know how to defend himself against. Our mother had written, you were never irresponsible. You were only guilty of wanting a life that could not be measured in a spreadsheet. David covered his eyes with one hand. Then she wrote, I know you thought leaving made you less loyal. It didn't. It only made you less available to be drafted into everyone else's panic. There is a difference. That one landed because it was true. He sat back in his chair and for the first time since the funeral I saw my brother look relieved. Elaine was next. She started crying before she got through the first paragraph. My mother wrote to her with the gentlest kind of precision, which is to say she did not patronize her. She told Elaine she had spent her life making herself easier for everyone else to love and harder for herself to inhabit. She told her that kindness can become a form of self-erasure if you are always the one absorbing the weather. You are not fragile, the letter said. You were trained to be careful with everyone else's storms. Elaine had to stand up. She walked to the window and held one hand over her her mouth while she read. And then it was my turn. I had known, even before I opened it, that mine would not be about being noticed. My mother had never confused me with someone loud enough to require correction. My problem in the family had always been the opposite. I was the one who stepped into other people's pain before they had to name it. I had become a translator of everyone's feelings and then, over time, a collector of all the feelings nobody wanted to keep. My mother knew that. My letter began, "You have spent your whole life translating this family into something it could survive hearing." I had to stop there for a second because I could hear her voice in the sentence. Then she wrote, "I am sorry I asked you to do that so often. It was not your job. It was mine." I cried immediately, not because it was dramatic, because it was specific, because it named the invisible work and made it visible without turning it into praise. She wrote that I was not invisible, only private. She wrote that I had mistaken privacy for smallness and patience for absence, and that she had watched me do it for so long she had started to worry I would forget I was in the room. Then she wrote, "You are the one who understands the whole shape of a thing. Use that well." I set the letter on my lap and closed my eyes. No one spoke for a while after that. 5 adults, all of us well into our 40s or 50s except Elaine, sitting around a dining table in the house we grew up in, each holding a version of our mother that was somehow both familiar and new. And because my mother had apparently not intended to be gentle in any predictable way, each envelope also contained a small object tucked beneath the letter. Richard found the house key, the old brass one from our childhood home before they moved, the one he had assumed would belong to him because he had always been the one who knew where every spare key was kept. Catherine found a stack of her old grade school essays, annotated in my mother's handwriting. David found a cassette tape labeled with a song title he hadn't heard in 20 years. Elaine found the recipe card box. I found my mother's red pen. Not sentimental, not random, specific. Each object came with a note. "For Richard, you always thought being first meant being in charge. It doesn't. It means you were frightened first. For Catherine, you do not have to sharpen everything to make it true. For David, leaving is not the same as abandoning. Stop punishing yourself for understanding that too late. For Elaine, being soft is not the same as being small. For me, you already know what everyone feels. Start asking what you feel." That was the sentence that undid me. Because my mother had been watching the one thing I never let myself ask out loud. What do I feel when I am not translating everyone else? What do I want when nobody is asking me to mediate? What am I carrying that I have called useful because calling it burdened would make me admit it had a weight? I folded that note and put it in my pocket. Richard looked up across the table. "She wrote ours before she got sick." "Some of them," I said. He frowned. "What do you mean?" I looked down at my letter again, at the revisions in her handwriting, at the way the pen pressure changed near the end of certain paragraphs. "She came back 4 times," I said. "Martin said that." Catherine lifted her eyes. "You think she changed them after the diagnosis?" I looked at the envelope and knew the answer before I said it. Yes. No one said anything after that, because suddenly the letters had become something larger than grief. They had become evidence, not of a betrayal, of a mind at work, of a woman who had known enough about her children to revise the future after she saw it coming. And that was when I realized my mother had not left us a sentimental keepsake. She had left us a correction. That was when I realized my mother had not left us a sentimental keepsake. She had left us a correction. David leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Wait, so she knew she was dying, and she spent the last 11 months rewriting these letters?" "Yes," I said. Catherine shook her head. "Why didn't she just tell us any of this while she was alive?" Richard looked up. "Because we would have argued with her." There was a beat of silence after that, because every single one of us knew he was right. We would have argued, we would have denied, we would have made joke, we would have turned every single one of those sentences into a fight. She had known that. She had known us well enough to know that the only way we would ever actually hear something true about ourselves was if she said it after she was gone. Before I tell you what happened next, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to the thing none of us saw that afternoon. The thing that Martin Hayes had left on the sideboard, face down, that none of us had noticed. It was a 6th envelope. I saw it almost an hour after Martin had left. It was sitting on the edge of the sideboard, half hidden behind a vase of daffodils. Same cream paper, same handwriting, no name on the front. I stood up and walked over and picked it up. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, it said, "For whoever finds this first." I opened it. The first line was, "I told Martin to tell you the letters were identical. They are not." I sat down very slowly on the arm of the couch. The rest of the note said, "If you are reading this, one of you has already noticed. If I had told you they were different, you would have spent the whole afternoon counting sentences, comparing length, arguing about who got more, who got less, who was loved best. You would have turned the most important thing I ever wrote to you into a competition. That is what siblings do. That is what I have watched you do for 45 years. So I lied. I told you they were the same, so you would read yours first. So you would hear what I had to say to you before you started measuring it against what I had to say to anyone else." I looked up from the note. All 4 of them were staring at me. "What does it say?" Elaine asked. I read it out loud. When I finished there was a very long silence. Then Richard laughed. A loud, helpless, completely unguarded laugh that I had not heard come out of him since he was 14 years old. Of course she did, he said. Catherine put her head in her hands and laughed until she cried. David shook his head and said, "God damn it, Joan." Elaine wiped her eyes and smiled. That was the moment it clicked for all of us. That was the moment we stopped being 5 siblings holding 5 separate letters and started being 5 people who had just been outmaneuvered by a dead woman. And she had done it perfectly. She had known exactly what we would do. She had known exactly how we would turn love into a ledger. She had known exactly what lie she needed to tell to make us actually listen. She had spent 11 months building this trap, and every single one of us had walked directly into it. The note went on. Equal love is not the same thing as identical love. I did not love any one of you more than any other, but I did not love you all the same way. That would have been lazy. That would have meant I was not paying attention. I loved Richard for his reliability. I loved Catherine for her anger. I loved Nora for her quiet. I loved David for his distance. I loved Elaine for her softness. I did not write 5 identical letters because that would not have been equal. That would have been indifferent. Equal is giving each of you exactly what you needed to hear. Equal is paying attention. I sat there holding that note and I understood something that I had never understood about my mother before that day. All those years I had thought she was fair because she never took sides. That was not it. She was fair because she took every side. She saw every one of us completely. She did not have a favorite. She had 5 separate favorites. That is the thing no one ever tells you about having more than one child. You do not split your heart into pieces. You grow a whole new heart for each one. No one had ever said that out loud to us before. The note ended. If you are all still talking to each other by dinner, I will consider this a success. I folded the note and put it on the table between us. No one said anything for almost 20 minutes. At one point Richard said, very quietly, "I always thought she loved David best." Catherine looked up. "I always thought she loved Richard best." David laughed. "I always thought she loved Elaine best." Elaine wiped her eyes. "I always thought she loved Nora best." They all looked at me. I shook my head. "I always thought she didn't have a favorite. That she was just counting." That was the moment all 5 of us realized we had spent 45 years competing for a prize that did not exist. We had all been wrong. Every single one of us. And she had known. The rest of that afternoon became something I still cannot describe properly. It was not grief. It was not relief. It was the feeling of having a weight you had carried for so long you had forgotten it was there, lifted off your shoulders all at once. We compared letters. We read lines out loud. We found the places where she had used almost the same sentence but changed one word, because that one word was the difference between what Richard needed to hear and what Catherine needed to hear. We found the line that appeared in all 5 letters buried at the end of each one that none of us had noticed. "I am proud of you." All 5 of us had read that line. All 5 of us had skipped over it because we had been so busy looking for the secret, for the favoritism, for the judgment, that we had missed the most obvious thing she had said. At one point Catherine said, "She really did know every single one of us." Richard nodded. "Better than we know each other. Better than we know ourselves," David said. Elaine looked out the window. "I wish she had told us." I said, "She did tell us. We just weren't listening. We stayed until the sun went down. We ordered pizza. We drank the bottle of wine my mother had left in the fridge for after the funeral. We told stories about her that none of us had told before. We argued about who got the old armchair. We agreed that none of us wanted the dining table. At 9 o'clock that night we locked the front door and walked out to our cars. Richard hugged me before he left, which he had not done in 22 years. Catherine apologized for the fight we had had at Christmas. David said he would come home more often. Elaine said she would host dinner once a month. None of us promised we would never fight again. None of us pretended everything would be perfect from now on. But something had shifted. Something permanent. The ledger that all 5 of us had been keeping in our heads for 45 years had been closed. A month later we met for dinner at Elaine's house. 3 months after that Richard called a family meeting and said he did not want to be the one in charge anymore. 6 months after that David moved back. Not permanently, but enough that he was there for birthdays and holidays and the small ordinary things. 1 year to the day after that afternoon in the dining room I opened the drawer of my desk and took out my letter. I still keep it there. Not folded. Not in an envelope. Open on top of the stack of papers so I can see it when I sit down. People ask me sometimes what the moral of this story is. They ask me if it is about grief, or about family, or about love. It is not. It is about attention. It is about the fact that most people will spend their whole lives telling you that equal love means treating everyone the same. And that is a lie. That is the laziest possible version of love. True equal love is treating everyone differently. It is paying enough attention to know exactly what each person needs to hear. It is knowing that the thing that will heal one person will break another. It is knowing that love is not a template. It is custom work. My mother did not write 5 letters. She built 5 mirrors. And she lied to us about them being identical because she knew we would never look into them if we thought anyone else's mirror was clearer. That is the greatest act of love I have ever seen anyone perform. It was quiet. It was deliberate. It was planned in advance. It required lying to the people she loved most in the world. world. And at work, I still run into people who knew my mother sometimes. They say she was a nice woman, a good teacher, quiet, firm, fair. They never knew. They never knew that she spent the last 11 months of her life sitting at her kitchen table at 2 in the morning rewriting letters, one word at a time, because she wanted to fix the thing that had been broken in her family for 45 years, and she knew it was the only way. They never knew that she built a trap out of love, and that every single one of us walked into it grateful. Last month Richard called me. He said he had been cleaning out the attic and he had found a notebook. It was my mother's, dated from the last 3 months of her life. He read me one line from it. The greatest thing you can do for the people you love is give them a version of themselves that they can be proud of. That was it. That was the whole point. That was what all 5 letters were. That was what the lie was. That was what the whole thing had been built for. She had not come to say goodbye. She had come to set us free. If this stayed with you, share it with a sibling, or with the person in your life who always knows what everyone else is feeling before they say it. Drop a comment and tell me which letter would have hit you hardest. Tell me if you have ever had someone see you that clearly. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.